Welcome to the latest webinar from the ABA Criminal Justice Section, co-sponsored by the Section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. We would like to share that the Criminal Justice Section will host in-person programming and committee meetings at the upcoming ABA annual meeting in San Francisco, August 8th to 11th. Please visit our website and click on the Events tab for more information. Before we get started with today's webinar, Solitary Confinement, Legal and Scientific Issues for Children and Young Adults, we would like to address a few housekeeping matters. During today's program, you can ask questions of our panelists by finding the Questions drop-down box on the right-hand side panel and typing in your questions. There will be time at the end for our panelists to address them. Also, on the panel is a handouts drop-down where you can access a recent article on solitary confinement. We will be sharing a recording of this program with the handouts to everyone who is registered so that you can share it widely with your networks. Please be advised that this program is not CLE accredited. Finally, if you like our work, we invite you to become a member of the Criminal Justice Section and collaborate with us on projects you want to develop and offer to our members and the general public. Please call 1-800-285-2221 or visit americanbar.org and click on Join in the top navigation bar. We are thrilled to bring you today's program on solitary confinement. Our moderator, Judge Jay Blitzman, will introduce you to the panelists and share opening remarks. Judge Blitzman?
Thank you. Good afternoon. In August of 2017, the American Bar Association passed Resolution 112E, resolved that the American Bar Association urges federal, state, local, territorial, and tribal legislative bodies and governmental agencies to enact laws and adopt policies prohibiting the use of solitary confinement, defined as the involuntary placement alone in a cell, room, or other area for any reason other than as a temporary response to behavior that threatens immediate harm and ends when the threat is over, and in no case more than 4 hours of children and youth under the age of 18. Joining us this afternoon to take a deeper dive into this conversation are Eric Drogin from the Harvard Medical School, Catherine Jones, and Linda Britton from the American Bar Association. I will serve as the moderator of this panel. I am the first justice of the Middlesex Division of the Massachusetts Juvenile Court. Prior to my appointment, I was the founder and director of the Roxbury Youth Advocacy Project, which became the basis to create a statewide public defender unit. Eric Drogin is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, a fellow of the American Academy of Forensic Psychology, a diplomat and former president of the American Board of Forensic Psychology, and a diplomat of the American Board of Professional Psychology. Dr. Drogin holds faculty appointments at the Harvard Medical School and is a member of the program in psychiatry at the law at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center. Catherine Jones will be sharing her lived experience as a person who tragically has had to endure the horrors of solitary confinement. Arrested at 13 years of age for murder, convicted and sentenced to 18 years of prison time, of which she served 17 years and 4 months. She has dedicated her time to education and rehabilitation, earning her GED while incarcerated, a degree in several certifications, including becoming a certified law clerk. She became a member of Fresh Start Ministries, creating and teaching curriculum that promoted emotional and spiritual healing for abused women. Upon her release in 2015, Catherine joined the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. In 2018, she founded her company, Breaking Free MVMT, which offers mentorship to formerly incarcerated women and juveniles. Linda Britton, who is batting cleanup, is the Director of Standards and Policy for the Criminal Justice Section. She previously served as the Director of the Commission on Youth at Risk for 4 years and started a career with the ABA with the Center on Children and the Law on a project to improve youth participation in child welfare cases. Her career spanned 40 years, practicing in Minnesota as an appellate public defender, a prosecutor in Hennepin County, and spending 25 years in Texas as the grand jury attorney for the Collin County DA's office, serving in private practice, and from 1999 to 2012, serving as a juvenile court magistrate hearing both delinquency and dependency cases. We envision making brief presentations to frame the issues, and then hopefully we'll have time for a robust question and answer period of time. In May of 2010, while walking down the streets in the Bronx, returning home from a party, 16-year-old Kalief Browder was arrested and accused of stealing a backpack some days before. It became readily apparent that there was some factual ambiguity about whether or not Kalief had actually taken the backpack, and the reports about when the backpack had been taken changed from May 2nd to May 8th. Tragically, Kalief Browder was subsequently held and detained at Rikers Island. Interestingly, as we talk about today's seminar, which is entitled Taking a Closer Look at Solitary Confinement, this, in fact, was the title of one of Kalief Browder's last papers, which she wrote when attending Bronx Community College in 2015. Shortly thereafter, as some of you may know, unfortunately, Kalief Browder committed suicide. Kalief's tragic saga has been chronicled in an article called Before the Law by Jennifer Gonnerman, published in the New Yorker on October 6, 2014, which details the tragic odyssey that he endured while at Rikers Island. Accused of stealing that backpack, as I indicated, he would spend the next 3 years of his life battling the case. Almost 2 years of that time was spent in solitary confinement. He was released ultimately in May of 2013 after repeatedly rejecting pleas to take time served or to plead guilty, insisting on his factual innocence. And in fact, the case was ultimately dismissed in May of 2013. During his incarceration, Kalief missed his high school graduation. He missed his junior year in high school. And while incarcerated, he attempted suicide on at least 2 or 3 occasions. The issues that we're talking about this afternoon are indeed consequential. They implicate not only the issue of solitary confinement, they implicate the issues that go to the heart of the equity of our juvenile criminal justice system, including detention, the purpose of detention, bail, due process, Sixth Amendment speedy trial rights, legislation that is pending across the country to raise the age, as well as the Prison Rape Enforcement Act, so-called PREA. I'm mentioning these issues in terms of framing the conversation because it's significant to note, and indeed imperative that we do so, to realize that when Kalief was arrested, he was less than a month before becoming 17 years of age. Had Kalief been arrested in virtually any other state in the country at that time, with the exception of North Carolina, he would have been charged in a juvenile court. Given the fact that the age of adult jurisdiction in New York State in 2010 was 16, Kalief in fact went to Rikers Island. He was held on bail, $3,000 cash, which could not be posted by his family. One of the questions that arise, of course, was the bail set in order to ensure court appearance, or was it a way that had the net effect of criminalizing Kalief's inability to pay that fee, the so-called criminalization of poverty, which is why I believe that detention and bail go to the heart of the conversation. As regards the issue of how a person could be detained in a criminal justice system for 3 years without trial, it's important to also consider whether or not speedy trial was a robust concept at that juncture. In looking at Kalief Browder's subsequent history after leaving prison in May of 2015. One of his last papers, as I noted, is entitled A Closer Look at Solitary Confinement in the United States. And I'm looking at the document now in my lobby. The essay is dated May 11th, 2012. And in discussing the evolution of solitary confinement, Kalief Browder notes that the first institution in the United States to experiment with isolation was the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia, which was built at the end of the 18th century. Interestingly, the concept of solitary confinement was an idea that came in part from the Quakers, who believed that solitude and penitence would be part of the rehabilitative process. The traumatic effects of solitary confinement and incarceration became well documented. By the end of the 19th century, solitary confinement had been virtually abolished in the United States. However, in the latter part of the 20th century, this practice experienced a resurgence. Now, the wisdom of this policy is being revisited. And in doing so, we're mindful of the fact that the Supreme Court has acknowledged through a variety of cases that adolescents are categorically different than adults. What does this mean both in terms of detention? Certainly, what does it mean in terms of solitary confinement? There's a growing body of research which supports the reality that solitary confinement is traumatic. Dr. Andrew Clark has suggested that in some instances, indeed, solitary confinement may be a form of child abuse, as well as cruel and unusual punishment. And it'll be interesting to hear from Eric and the others whether or not, in some context, solitary confinement might actually implicate mandated reporting. So I look forward to listening to my colleagues as they navigate this landscape. Our first speaker in addressing this issue will be Catherine Jones, as I indicated, who will share her lived experience regarding what she endured in the prison system. Catherine?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Catherine Jones, and I am the founder of Breaking Free Movement, which is an organization with a triune mission. And the first part of our mission is to encourage, empower, and educate at-risk youth, because we believe that prevention will avoid intervention later on. We educate legislators, educators, and the general public on the realities of juvenile incarceration. And we mentor individuals that are in transition from prison to the free world by giving them the resources, the knowledge, and the tools they need in order to be successful. And the reason I got involved in this is because I've lived this experience. It's very personal for me. I am one of America's formerly incarcerated youth. And at the age of 13, I was convicted of murder and sentenced to 18 years. At that time, that was rare. It's a lot more common these days, but when I was sentenced to an adult prison, the Florida penal system did not really know what to do with me. Looking at me now as what many call a success story, there are people that would come to the conclusion that my juvenile imprisonment worked. But the truth of the matter is that I became who I am despite my experience in the Florida penal system. When they sentenced me at the age of 13, they came to the conclusion that I was too young to actually go to adult prison. So they would sentence me until I was 21 to a juvenile prison. Once again, it was unheard of then. They had never done it before. And so they made the mistake of sending me to an adult prison about a month after I was sentenced at 14. And when I got there, they were like, what do we do with her? We don't know how to house her. It's too dangerous to put her with the adult population, but we do not have a separate housing unit for juveniles. So they placed me in solitary confinement. And I was in solitary confinement for almost 6 months. And in those 6 months, I did not go through the regular orientation phase that most of the individuals go through when they went there. So I did not know anything about how anything worked. I didn't know that there was a librarian that I could request books. I didn't know that there was a canteen that I could purchase hygiene items from. I didn't know that there was a medical unit that when I didn't feel well, I could go and put in a sick call form. I didn't learn any of the protocol of the penal system. So I was simply inside of a 9 by 12 cell and what they used to call the hot box, because it was a it had a tar roof, and in the summer, it would get like 110 degrees in there. It was sweltering. We would literally put our sheets in the toilet and wet them and lay them on top of us to cool us down. There was no ventilation, and in the winter, it was freezing. And all we had was one wool blanket, one cotton blanket, and 2 sheets. The rules were that people in confinement could not speak to each other. So if I was to communicate or speak to the other prisoners, I would be disciplined. The people that I was housed with in there were people that had disciplinary infractions, that had committed some type of wrong, and I was held to the same standards and under the same guidelines as them. I was only allowed to shower 3 times a week for 10 minutes. There was very little light. I did not learn until probably a month before I was transferred that I could actually get books. And we were only permitted 2 a week. And of course, when you're locked in a cell for 24 hours, you will read 2 books in 3 hours. So I would just read the same book over and over again. And at the age that I was at 14, this was a time when you're developing your social skills and learning just the basic principles of communicating with other people and how to handle conflict. And at the time when that was imperative for me, I was in solitary confinement. And I was treated as though I was a disciplinary problem, and I wasn't. So the only stories that I heard about prison were from the people that were technically the rule breakers. They were the bad girls, so to speak, of the prison system. And they became kind of mentors and friends to me. And so I befriended probably not the best group of people. And because that was all of the communication and contact that I had when I was in there, I was scared. I was put, of course, at that age, being put in adult prison, you heard stories. I had seen movies. And so I found a safety in this group of people. And they're going to come into play later on into my story, because after 6 months, they said, hey, we made a mistake. This is a lawsuit. If she breaks her ankle here, she's going to sue us because she's not supposed to be here. So they sent me to a juvenile program where I was supposed to remain until I was 21. And the problem with that was they sent me to a juvenile program that was meant to house people no longer than 18 months. So now they have an individual there with an 18-year prison sentence, and they have no security for that. They did not have barbed wire. They did not have any type of protocol set up to prevent an escape because it was a very short-term program. So once again, they put me in like a solitary confinement. Because you had to go into another building and walk outside to go eat with other people, I had to eat in my room by myself because they thought it was too risky for me to be able to go to the dining room. So I was isolated once again from everyone else. I was treated a lot different. I did not have access to a lot of the perks of being in a juvenile prison. I didn't get weekend passes. And it was a kind of like they figured it out as they went. An issue would arise, and I'd say, well, hey, can I do this? And they were like, no, you can't do it because you're an escape risk. And so the superintendent was, she was kind of dumbfounded about what to do with me. And that seemed to be the story of my life until I turned like 17 or 18 in the penal system. So I had a desire, because most of the people there for petty crimes, they're juveniles, sentenced as juveniles. I was kind of ostracized because I had a murder conviction. So I wanted to go back to the place where there were people like me. That's that part of us as human beings that just want to belong, that want to, or as what in high school, you want to click with people because you have similar backgrounds or stories or interests. And so I began to get in trouble, and so that I could go back to prison, because the rule was that I could stay there till I was 21 unless I got disciplinary infractions, and at that time I would be transferred back to prison. So I wasn't there 9 months, and I got into enough trouble where they said, okay, you're going back to prison. That would sound sad and depressing. For me, that was very exciting because I was going back to a place where I wouldn't be looked at as someone different. So I was transferred back to prison, and I went back to Broward Correctional Institution this time, and then I went through the same process again. They did not know what to do with me. They did not know how to house me. So they placed me in confinement once again for several months. And finally, the warden came and said, you know what, we're going to release you back into adult population. We're not going to make you a youthful offender. You have too much time. Your charges are too severe. And so we're going to place you in adult population. And when I was in adult population, because I had been in solitary confinement for almost 2 years, I had become adapted to being alone. I wanted to be by myself in my own area, in charge of my own area. So every chance I got, up until I was maybe 23 years old and matured a little bit, I got into trouble so that I can go back to solitary confinement because that's what was comfortable for me. And in those 2 years, some of the things that I experienced impacted me for all the way through my adult life. There was a staff member that reached his hand into the food slot when I was 15 years old and gave me my tray and began to caress my breast. And when I went to report it to a captain that night, she was very upset and she went to an inspector, and I was called into the inspector's office. And I found out that that staff member was a friend of the sergeant that committed the sexual assault. And he told me that if I wanted to pursue the complaint, that I would be protected and placed in confinement indefinitely. Unless, of course, I signed a statement that stated that I misinterpreted his actions. He let me know that Sergeant was Italian, and sometimes they can be a little friendly with their hands, but he didn't mean any harm. So I wrote the statement because at that point I was close to getting out. They were discussing releasing me, and I didn't want to stay in there any longer than I did. My access to feminine hygiene products was very limited because I did not have access to the canteen, as though I was in disciplinary confinement. So I had to go by the same rules. So for years, I was not able to get a hot sandwich. I was restricted to the 3 meals a day that we received from the chow hall. The basic privileges, quote unquote, that you get in prison were denied to me as a juvenile. So I actually had, once I was released, had gone so far as to run away from the correctional officers when they tried to handcuff me. And at that time, I was assaulted by 5 correctional officers, 4 men and 1 woman, and thrown back into confinement. And I was held under investigation there until I healed and didn't have any more bruises, and I was released. And I just went through that process until I was like 23 years old. I was incarcerated, placed in solitary confinement for skipping school. I was placed in solitary confinement for being late for school. Infractions that if I had been a free teenager would have been considered pretty minor and pretty typical. But because of the environment that I was in, I was spending 15 to 90 days in confinement for these very small infractions. So when I look at, well, as I got older and I seen other juveniles come in and going through the same process that I went through, I've made it my life's mission to tell people about what it is like, the reality of being incarcerated as a juvenile, and then the effects that that solitary confinement has on you. To this day, I'm 34 years old and I'm scared to go be in the dark. I dreamed when I was in confinement of being somewhere that was completely dark because they always had like these yellow security lights on so they could see us when they walked in our rooms. And I was like, I can't wait to be in the dark. But those years spent in solitary confinement, because the initial 2 years was just the beginning, because then I was in solitary confinement every other month for an extended period of time for my disciplinary infractions. So out of 17 years, I spent approximately 9.5 of them inside of the solitary confinement cell. Some under administrative confinement, like when I first was incarcerated and they didn't know what to do with me, and a majority of it for disciplinary confinement, because I found comfort in confinement. So when everything on the compound became too much for me, I just put myself back in there. And so it developed a fear of the dark. It developed a fear of being attacked. And so when I walk to my car in the dark, I always have somebody walk with me. It's a fear of insects, because when you're in confinement, Lowell had a very huge roach problem, and you would be laying in your bed in confinement and they would crawl on you and you can't get away because you're locked behind a locked door. So now I have a phobia of insects. So, and it's small things that it seems like it's just not such a big deal, but when you're young, it leaves an impression on you for the rest of your life. And so it's my hope that through organizations like the ABA, and to get this topic out there into the public, and to hear stories about people that have lived experience like myself, that the policies will change, that there will be more people rallying to end juvenile solitary confinement inside the penal systems nationwide. It's inhumane, and all of the scientific statistics will be discussed later in the panel. And that's pretty much it. That's my story. That's my life's work. That's my passion, and that's why I do what I do.
So, Catherine, thank you so much for so bravely and candidly sharing your saga. And what you've shared directly connects to some of the issues that I hoped we would be discussing this afternoon. You were 13 when you went into the adult system. Should we be putting juveniles into adult systems for such long periods of time at such young ages? That's one of the issues, obviously. The abuse that you're subjected to in an adult system, again, with Kalief Browder at age 16, imagine what would have happened if were he arraigned in a juvenile session in a family court in New York. Very unlikely that he would have experienced the type of trauma and hell that he endured while at Rikers Island. And ultimately, when we look at this issue from a public policy point of view, does solitary confinement actually enhance or improve public safety outcomes? The research shows that adolescents, persons under the age of 18 put into adult facilities are 3 to 5 times more likely to be assaulted, both physically and sexually. If anything, recidivism is not reduced, it's increased by such experiences. And research done by the Pew Charitable Trust and Reforming Juvenile Justice, a developmental perspective published by the OJJDP in 2013, are starting to show that there's really no correlation with prolonged detention and reduction of recidivism. So again, thank you so much, Catherine, for sharing. I'm going to turn the conversation over now to Dr. Eric Drogin from Harvard Medical School. Eric?
Thank you, Judge. I'd like to weigh in on the psychological perspective on these things. And as we'll see this afternoon, it's not as if people come from just a single perspective or are addressing a single issue. We've already heard quite a bit about psychology from the judge and from Catherine. I'd like to start by thanking you all for allowing me to take part in this. Psychology is typically in the criminal justice system on the outside looking in. Those of you who work with expert witnesses know that sometimes the doctors can get a little full of themselves and think that the courtroom is the medical school. It isn't. So humility is definitely a plus in these situations. And again, I'm just glad to be here to be able to share a bit of information and fold it in to what the rest of us are discussing. I'd like to start first by looking at the issue, and of course we've already gotten a very substantive answer to this, as to what's so bad about being alone. How different is this really from what we experience as kids on the positive side? As busy professionals, doesn't it seem attractive on some level for us to be able to get away for a while, not to be bothered, not to have the phone ring? As we've already seen from what Catherine has explained to us firsthand, there's a difference between time off and being placed in time off. There is a difference that is very significant, and this is not a new notion to the field of psychology. The studies that really got us started looking at the effects of isolation happened roughly 60 years ago, started in the 1950s. There was some research with students at McGill University in Montreal, And the way the doctors styled the study at that point was the effects of exposure for prolonged periods to a rigidly monotonous environment. I don't know how many of you have been to Montreal. We can't see a show of hands, but no, Montreal is a great place to be. So what did they try to do? They would take the student participants, and here's how it worked back then. If you wanted to pass Psychology 101, you would sign up for the studies. I remember doing it myself many years ago. And what the students would do is, according to the written instructions, lie on a comfortable bed in a lighted cubicle 24 hours a day. So at least a comfortable bed. And they would get, quote, time out only for meals. These were usually eaten sitting on the edge of that bed, and they were allowed to use the restroom. But that was it. Otherwise, back to your lighted cubicle. And when they were writing up the results of this study in the Scientific American some 63 years ago, the conclusion was prolonged exposure to a monotonous environment then has definitely deleterious effects. The individual's thinking is impaired. He, because back then everything was he, shows childish emotional responses. His visual perception becomes disturbed. He suffers from hallucinations. His brainwave pattern changes. The recent studies indicate that normal functioning of the brain depends on a continuing arousal reaction. Under these circumstances, the activity of the cortex may be impaired so that the brain behaves abnormally. So what we're talking about here is that it doesn't take very long at all for people to have trouble thinking. Their emotional responsibilities are addled. They see things that aren't really there. They have hallucinations outright. They did some follow-up studies with this where they would put people in isolation tanks, and it was thought that maybe it would take several hours for them to start to hallucinate. In most cases, this occurred in a matter of minutes. It was clear even at that time that the brain is an interactive organ, and it is geared to respond to outside stimuli. And we might think, well, I guess the solution to that is just to let them back out. However, what we found in such studies is that we have very significant ongoing problems, as we'll see, as a result of this insult to the brain and to people's ability to interact. These studies were not only done with human beings, and what is certainly not a proud chapter in the history of psychology. There were studies at the University of Wisconsin with psychologist Harry Harlow. You would not be able to do a lot of these studies, I think, today. Rhesus monkeys were put in a solitary chamber that was nicknamed the Pit of Despair. I don't think you'd see that sort of approach today. It was an inverted pyramid, and the chamber had these slippery slides that made it just about impossible to climb out. It only took a day or two for the monkeys, and again, as a trigger warning, this is not very pleasant stuff to talk about. They would sit hunched at the bottom of the machine. It was presumed that they found their situation to be hopeless. They were described as profoundly disturbed. They would stare blankly and rock back and forth in place. And I will deliberately avoid getting into some of the more unpleasant details. But it was found that after 12 months of isolation, they had basically no social capacity at all. And again, we're not endorsing this approach. And today, something like this would surely never make it past the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. But we can see that over 6 decades ago, we're already seeing a considerable amount of study into these sorts of issues. There is a syndrome associated with solitary confinement and similar circumstances of deprivation called chronic social isolation. It's been recognized for several decades as a source of major psychological stress, and it has a lot of medical and psychiatric sequela, which is our fancy way of saying things that happen as a result of it. There are major biological systems that are implicated in CSI, neuroendocrine problems, the immune system, the automatic nervous system, and studies of CSI have shown that, among other things, it contributes to increased mortality in human beings. In the 70s in particular, we had studies that showed higher mortality rates for people who were exposed to CSI. In addition to that, we had studies related to this issue that talked about an increased risk of strokes in human beings, in both males and females. There was a study that showed that there was a 44% increased risk of incident for strokes with men and women who had smaller social networks, who had less and less exposure to other people. And apart from a specific incident like a stroke, we have also seen that there is a more general cognitive decline in human beings as a result of social isolation. There's an increase in the risk of future cognitive impairment when persons are older. This has to do with elevated cortisol levels, all sorts of issues. And apart from a general lapse in ability, there is also a relationship with dementia, and in particular Alzheimer's disease, for people who have been in enforced isolation. The mental illness effects in general, apart from the specific ones that have been mentioned, have to do not only with the problems that are caused as a result of segregated housing, but the exacerbation, the worsening of symptoms as a result for people who already have some degree of mental illness. For people who had no history of mental health problems, in studies, there's evidence that the time spent in isolation can lead to specifically anxiety, confusion, violent outbursts, and again, in line with earlier studies going back decades, perceptual distortions and hallucinations. But in persons who already have serious mental illness, it's been seen to lead to psychotic decompensation or even suicide. One researcher working with folks under these conditions stated that these were the most severely psychotic people he had seen in more than 25 years of practice. Supermax, not a situation we would particularly expect to see for adolescents, although we do at times see this applied with young adults, is a situation where there's been a considerable amount of specific research. Persons exposed to supermax conditions in many cases are going to have a psychiatric predisposition to problems when they wind up being placed in there in the first place. There's quite a lot written about vulnerability of prisoners in supermax with pre-existing mental illness. The Human Rights Watch has estimated that 5% of the general prison population experiences some form of psychiatric illness, where more than half of the prisoners in segregated housing were mentally disordered. They were seen on the basis of these studies as ill-equipped to control their behavior and conform to the rules, which is often, of course, how they wound up there in the first place. It was seen that psychiatric disorders were worsened by depriving people of any opportunity for reality testing, as we put it. Severe psychiatric morbidity, disability, suffering, and mortality. There are medical issues that are associated with supermax that feed into psychiatric issues. And it's been advocated that if we do have these sorts of units, that they should be required to provide extensive mental health resources that are specifically targeted to ease the psychological pains of this sort of confinement. And we can apply the same principle to juvenile detention settings, to be sure. And Linda Britton, who will be following me, will have quite a bit to tell you about what our policies have been and what our resolutions have been concerning the treatment of juveniles and the notion of solitary confinement. Modern studies have followed pretty much the same path. There was a study written up in the American Journal of Public Health just a few years ago that indicated that in confinement settings, over 50% of self-harm incidents were those that took place among persons in solitary, making up only about 5% of the prison population, but over half of those people wound up harming themselves. Overall, half of completed suicides take place in solitary confinement situations. There are also longer-term issues about recidivism, because when the person's sentence is complete, what we will find is that they are often released directly to the streets. This is the same for adults and for juveniles as well. And we found that without the appropriate follow-up, including psychotherapy and counseling, there are difficulties in the long term. The American Association for the Advancement of Science recently conducted a panel discussion with experts and neurologists and activists, which referred overall to what they described as the destructive capabilities of solitary confinement.
Thank you, Eric.
Oh, sure.
Thank you. I don't mean to interrupt. You're segueing, correct?
Oh, yeah, and just a bit, keeping track of the clock too. I want to make sure not to eat up other people's time. Just one more set of comments, really having to do with the professional response to this. It hasn't just been scientific studies. It has not just been a question of research studies, but also a general sense from the psychiatric community in particular that it is time for some professional advocacy in this area. The American Psychiatric Association has weighed in on this topic, and in an editorial in the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law, Kenneth Applebaum, noted psychiatrist, talked about the adverse effects that result from these sorts of things for adults and children as well, psychological, psychiatric, and physiological effects. And this, in line with the research upon which the doctors have been able to draw, has led for a widespread call for discontinuation and at very least medically minded control of these situations. And in a segue to Linda's policy and other material, I'd just like to point out that there have been recommendations from the United States Department of Justice concerning the use of what they like to call restrictive housing. And these folks are definitely with the program as well in terms of identifying what sorts of psychological resources would be necessary. And I'd like to go ahead now and pass the virtual microphone over to Linda Britton. And I do believe that there'll be some technical work from staff in order to hand over the control of the screen to Linda.
So before Linda begins, I just want to make this observation. I hope it's an issue we're able to address in the Q&A, and that is folks' opinions about Dr. Clark's provocative suggestion that in some instances, solitary confinement may well constitute child abuse. He writes provocatively about the possibility of mandated reporting being implicated. This augments or is arguably related to arguments made under the Eighth Amendment about cruel and unusual punishment.
Well, and Judge, just briefly, I'd say that as a mandated reporter, I believe we would have to take your suggestion very seriously. One out to that may be the law as it exists in many jurisdictions that points out that if the authorities are already aware of the situation, then you wouldn't have the standard mandatory report. Yet I think we can all see how it could mushroom beyond that and how in some jurisdictions they don't make that specification.
Well, I think it's a provocative area to think about, given the traumatic experiences shared by people like Catherine Jones and Kalief Browder. Linda?
Thank you very much, Judge. And thanks so much, Eric, for explaining the terribly damaging impact of solitary confinement on not just animals, not just youth, but also adults. And so the circumstances that we ended up with really starting about 8 to 10 years ago was that people across all branches of government started to realize that the use of solitary confinement in children and youth was just in opposition to any normative behavior, normative programs that would benefit children and youth. And President Obama first called for a ban on the use of solitary confinement back in January 2016 in federal juvenile facilities due to what he called devastating, lasting psychological conditions. At the same time, a number of organizations initiated public campaigns to bring awareness to the issue, 2 of which are Stop Solitary for Kids, and then there's an adult organization called Solitary Watch. Organizations that focus on the health and welfare of children and youth discuss this issue with their membership, and they passed resolutions that called for an end to the use of solitary confinement in all youth facilities. So you've had virtually every medical organization, such as the American Academy of Pediatrics, the AMA, the American Association of Child and Adolescent Psychiatrists, and the American Psychological Association, being very vocal about the harm that was being done to children and youth who were kept in isolation. Moreover, a number of legal organizations, including Catherine's, the Campaign for Fair Sentencing of Youth, plus policy organizations located here in D.C., the Coalition for Juvenile Justice and the National Juvenile Defender Center, and the Juvenile Law Center in Philadelphia, not only wrote policy statements on this issue, but they published white papers as well and encouraged the public press to write on this issue as well. And then finally, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges passed a lengthy resolution that called on the courts to work with state and local facilities to end this practice. And so, as I indicated, one of the very best websites to keep track of what is going on in this effort to prohibit the use of solitary confinement for youth is Stop Solitary for Kids. It's a very broad-based organization that, as you can see, was organized in part by the Council of Juvenile Correctional Administrators. So you have a wide breadth of professionals who all agree that this is a practice that needs to come to an end. Their website, as I said, has a lot of really good information. It's worth checking out, and I would also check out the ACLU website as well as the Vera Institute. And so by the fall of 2016, at that time I was directing the Commission on Youth at Risk, and we decided to sponsor a resolution to be enacted by the ABA. We wrote a resolution that's slightly different than what was passed. Our original resolution simply urged jurisdictions to pass laws and enact policies to prohibit the use of solitary confinement for children and youth under 18, whether they were in juvenile or adult institutions. And then we asked the criminal justice section to co-sponsor the resolution in order to give us a stronger voice and make it more likely that it would be enacted by the House of Delegates. I also had conversations with other professionals like Dr. Drogin, who oppose the use of solitary confinement for adults as well. And we came to a strategic decision that by moving first on the resolution banning its use for youth under 18, that would logically lead us to be able to follow up with a similar resolution to limit its use with adult detainees and prisoners. Because of course, it's, when we talk about adolescent brain science and its impact, not just on juveniles, we have to look at its impact as well on young adults, those young people who are between the ages of 18 to 25, who more resemble adolescents than they do adults. But getting both organizations really on the same page proved to be somewhat difficult. In the report, we were clear that the only reason to use solitary confinement with youth was in order to respond to the threat of physical harm, and then to limit its use to the period of time necessary to resolve the threat. A number of lawyers felt that we should clarify the resolution and include the stipulation that there should be an outside limitation. And so because federal legislative bills were using the period of time of 4 hours, the amendment to the resolution included that same period of time. And we went back and forth because some of us felt that no matter what period of time was indicated as the maximum period, that institutions would find a way to always use the maximum period of time. But at the end of the day, the difference between 4 hours and then versus being kept in solitary confinement for months or even years is pretty substantial. So we went with that amendment. The House of Delegates enacted the resolution in August 2017, and so it became official ABA policy. You can find it under the criminal justice section on the ABA website, and we're in the process of attaching the reports for each of our resolutions so that readers can see the legal justification for the policy. If you would like a copy of the report, I'm happy to get it to you. Just let me know. And so I want to point out that according to the Annie E. Casey Foundation's Juvenile Justice Alternatives Initiative, the definition of solitary confinement pretty much lines up with what we did with the ABA resolution. And it indicates that it is the involuntary placement of a child or youth alone in a cell, room, or other area for any reason other than as a temporary response to behavior that threatens the imminent harm to the youth of others, and ends when the threat is over, and in no case more than 4 hours. What you see in a variety of facilities and institutions is that they may not use the word solitary confinement. They'll have some other euphemism which is a label that makes you think it's not really solitary. So they might use the word seclusion, isolation, segregation, room confinement. But when you take a closer look at the elements of that practice, you see that what they mean is solitary confinement. And what's important to remember about the whole notion of using isolation as a temporary response is that it's really a tool only to use when other de-escalation techniques fail, and only when there's a physical threat to someone. And so when you're looking at labels, you have to, as I said, consider the description. Solitary confinement is meant as punishment, and there are no positive outcomes to its use. And now I can't move forward. Let's see.
Linda, if you click on the actual screen, you'll be able to move it. You saw I had the same issue.
I got it. Thank you. So, as I said, what is important to remember about the use of solitary confinement with children and youth is that there are literally no positive outcomes. You have, as Dr. Drogin pointed out, severe harm to both the child's physical and mental health. It's linked to higher risks of suicide and attempted suicide, causes anxiety, depression, and trauma. There is an increased risk of cardiovascular problems. While you're in solitary confinement, there is no programming going on. You're not receiving any kind of education. You're not participating in therapy. And as a result, institutions face higher rates of aggression and conflict when they use solitary confinement, and it has no deterrent impact to self-destructive behavior. In contrast, a program that uses only a temporary timeout for exceptional circumstances is going to be pretty obvious. Instead, the separation is a brief intervention that's used when necessary to protect a child or another person. It would be used when other interventions have failed and only for the least amount of time that a child or youth needed to be alone in order to be protected from harm or protect someone else from harm. A counselor or officer would follow up with the child or the youth and bring her back or him back to the program once he or she regains self-control. It's very much what a parent would do with a child who lost it. And so what we really want to see is that facilities would use a behavior management system that relies on rewards and incentives. When isolation is used, it's intended to neutralize out-of-control behavior and allow it to be redirected into positive behavior. And so we would hope that staff training would stress adolescent development and the value of positive over negative reinforcement when dealing with youth. So the question becomes really, why do institutions use solitary confinement and why is it so difficult for them to abandon its use? There aren't any good reasons. The only reasons are reasons that are not in the best interest of the child. It's difficult to abandon because, frankly, it's an easy thing for institutions to do. It's a go-to practice when an institution doesn't hire enough people, doesn't educate its officers, and when the culture of the institution relies on petty rules and is focused on force, aggression, and punishment. It's a practice that relies on officers who prefer to just simply push kids away rather than engage with them, and who believe that youth are in these institutions because they are bad people. It's a cheap solution to housing children and youth who have suffered trauma in their lives. You have to remember, too, that many of the facilities that exist in states around this country, that, first of all, there's a huge number of private institutions that have very little oversight by the state, and there's very little incentive for them to build programs when the state only requires that they offer housing, food, and minimal exercise. In public facilities, they're often located, like in Texas, in rural areas where it's difficult to find, hire, and train people to work with troubled youth. Urban detention centers are likely to have better programs, and people, depending upon the juvenile judge and his or her ability to talk the county board into investing in youth, can tend to be some of the most successful ones in terms of reducing the use of solitary confinement. It's also important to remember that within one state, there can be great disparity in the use of solitary confinement because juvenile justice is such a local system. So as I said, what we have at this time is this national consensus to end the use of solitary confinement. Somewhere around 39 states have actually weighed in on this issue and have done something productive to try to move the needle forward. We have a number of states who have banned its use. We have correctional systems that have reduced its use, and we have lawsuits that have been brought to curb it. As Judge Blitzman indicated, there can be serious questions raised as to whether the use of solitary confinement violates the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment, given the evidence that isolating children are even more susceptible to mental anguish than adult convicts. And so, as of today, you see really a multiple-pronged approach in terms of trying to limit or reduce solitary confinement. There are lawsuits that have been brought in federal courts who have entered orders in at least 4 states against the use of solitary confinement of youth in their facilities. There are a number of states that have limited its use in the last 3 years, and there are states that banned its use even before that time. In December, Congress passed the First Step Act, and it limits the use of isolation only when there is a risk of immediate physical harm, not as a sanction or as punishment for youth who are in federal custody. But it's important to remember that that's a small number of youth across the country. More important, I think, is the reauthorization of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act in 2018, because it requires states now to report data on their use of isolation and what kind of strategies they have to curb its practice. And so,
I think the cops are coming to get you, Linda.
Like some other areas, like separating youth from adults by sight or sound, and the prosecution of status offenses that have really been minimized, or if not prohibited, because of JJDPA, I think that the reauthorization of that act and having these mandates will help states move forward substantially in terms of its use of solitary confinement. So here's a list of states that have been working on remedying the use of solitary confinement. And I think what is interesting to note is that in many of these states, it isn't just one thing that causes a good result. That means that we just somehow move to no solitary confinement and behavioral treatment programs that are appropriate for youth and are therapeutic in nature. For example, in California, they started with a state ban on the use of solitary confinement, but it didn't take very long before counties basically were just simply not complying with the state law, and so they had to have lawsuits brought in order to force it to happen. And ultimately, finally last year, Los Angeles County announced that it was disbanding its use. That's one, though, of 58 counties in the state. In Wisconsin, you might recall that first a lawsuit was brought against the sheriff in Milwaukee, and ultimately the success of that lawsuit, the information that was brought to the public's attention about the way youth were being treated, caused the state to enact a statute banning its use. New York City banned the use of solitary confinement, but we've learned that since then, detention officers have moved some youth to other cities in the state of New York that still use solitary confinement. And so it's just not a very simple process. There are, it appears that from just a lot of different directions, everyone has to kind of converge in order to make this practice cease and cease permanently. And so, as I said, once we passed the resolution and enacted it on juvenile solitary confinement, we went forward with the adult solitary resolution as well, which was passed at the mid-year meeting in 2018. And it is a different type of resolution simply because the range of situations that one might find with adults is substantially different than those that exist with youth and children. But again, and I hope Dr. Drogin might be asked a question about how it impacts adults. But I think that again, having this resolution is really helpful to the ABA and to our governmental affairs office so that they can focus on legislation that supports the reduction of solitary confinement. I've finally included a couple of resources that I hope will that you'll find helpful. I hope in closing that you'll do a lot of reading and find out what's happening in facilities and juvenile facilities in your state, both the county detention facilities as well as state institutions. I hope you'll think about organizing other lawyers in the juvenile courts in your area. Take a field trip to some of these facilities so that you can see what's going on, you can ask questions. If you want any other information about some of the legal solutions to solitary confinement, feel free to contact me. And with that,
thank you, Linda. I just want to get it back quickly to Kalief Browder in the spirit of bookending the presentation portion of this webinar. In his May 11, 2015 paper, A Closer Look at Solitary Confinement in the United States, which sadly turns out to be one of the last papers that he prepared prior to committing suicide, Kalief rhetorically asks the question, is solitary confinement a good or helpful way to rehabilitate inmates, or is solitary confinement only making matters worse? He goes on to conclude that he believes that the practice is in conflict with the Eighth Amendment and notes that instead of solitary confinement rehabilitating inmates, there is evidence of it actually causing severe mental health problems, not only for inmates, but for the families who have to live with the people who are released from institutions. So I think after hearing the presentations from this panel that Kalief Browder got it right, unfortunately. So Eric, do you want to address the question that Linda just posed, or do you think you've covered that in your presentation?
Specifically the notion about child abuse.
Well, I think the question that Linda, Linda poses the question about, we focused on juveniles and young adults, the so-called the emerging adult, the 18 to 25-year-old cohort. But I would imagine that this practice is fairly pernicious as regards anybody who's incarcerated in terms of the traumatic effects of isolation.
Yes, the science is squarely on your side in that argument. In every corner of the criminal justice system, we try to avoid the notion that children, adolescents are just shorter adults who aren't as smart as adults. They are fundamentally different in so many ways. But that having been said, this is something where it's pretty much the same. The basic neurobiological mechanism is the same. The nature of the insult to the brain and the harm to the individual is the same in its basic outline. And then what's left is a question of how much greater impact there is due to where you are in the developmental cycle. But the bottom line is that this is something that affects adults in fundamentally the same fashion.
Now, I don't know if there's been good empirical research on this, but my sense would be that people who have been exposed to solitary certainly don't do well, or I would imagine don't do as well, perhaps, as other individuals once they're released in terms of the ability to progress. I think, Catherine's saga, which makes Catherine's saga and journey all the more remarkable. But I wonder if this has been researched.
If I can chime in here,
Please.
there is no question, and as I said earlier, I've got a little emotional, and I've kind of composed myself to get back on track here, because it's so much more than the three things that I listed about the effect and how it affected me as an adult. I was involved with some very unhealthy codependent relationships, because it creates kind of a fear of being alone. Like you want companionship. Like a part of me wants to be alone, and I tell everybody, leave me alone. I can do everything myself, because I was by myself for so long. But at the same time, wanting to be connected to other people, whether it was a healthy or unhealthy relationship. And so all of that stems back, and I've gone through extensive counseling, and all of it stems back to my experiences as a youth in solitary confinement. And if I could piggyback on the discussion with the whether or not it could be considered child abuse to put a juvenile in solitary confinement in the penal system. Now, if I have two beautiful children and I have two older stepchildren, and I could not imagine a DHS worker if I put my child in their room because of some infraction that they did, and I put them in their room and served them 3 cold or at best lukewarm meals a day, and did not give them access to education or school, because programs are taken away from you when you are in confinement, whether you're in there for administrative or disciplinary reasons. And so if a child is told not to go to school for 30, 60, 90 days, does not have access to proper health care, they would take your child out of the home.
Well, Catherine, if I could jump in, one of the things that I found most striking about your presentation was the degree to which you were subjected to isolation and solitary for minor infractions. We're not talking about major assault of behavior, which ostensibly might be understandable to keep you or other inmates safe. You were apparently exposed and endured solitary, as did Kalief Browder, and I'm assuming countless others, for very, very minor infractions.
Yes, skipping school was one of the very minor ones. Being in an unauthorized area, going somewhere that you're not supposed to be because it's the wrong time, walking outside of the yellow line, and an officer's in a bad mood that day, and you don't get back fast enough, and then it's disrespect or disorderly or disobeying a verbal order, which are all considered minor infractions, but all that carry 30 days or more in solitary confinement. So yes, it is. I think maybe out of the 53 disciplinary reports that I had, maybe only 6 of them were either violent or major. The rest of them was relatively minor.
That's remarkable. That's remarkable. Well, remarkably depressing just to listen to, and I don't think I could have endured what you did. I have so much respect for you.
Thank you, and I appreciate that very much. And at the age of 15, and you mentioned it being depressing, I actually was placed on numerous, which I found out later was an excessive amount of psychiatric medications, from Cinequan and Seroquel and Prozac and Trazodone and 10X, because when you're in a cell for 24 hours, eventually your sleep cycles change. You don't have sunshine, and you get to go outside in like a dog kennel for 3 hours every 30 days when you are in confinement. So in order to cope, in order to just sleep and sleep and sleep to make the time go faster, I was on all kind of sleep aids and medications, and my body actually became quite dependent on them, where I couldn't eat or sleep or really function without them. So that was something, once again, that years of counseling and mental health treatment has helped me overcome. And I have successfully, with the help of some amazing mentors that I have and the support of my friends and my family. But so many people do not have that support system, and so they're or like Browder, he had that support and he still didn't overcome it. So the effects of confinement are real, and they need to be addressed on a national level.
And that's really important. You know, Linda, you addressed the issue of how arbitrary the system could be in our our juvenile justice, criminal justice by geography world. I mentioned the fact that Kalief Browder would have been treated as a juvenile in most systems, but also the quality and nature of the detention is so dramatically different across different systems.
It really is. And of course, that's something that is behind so much of the practice of solitary. If you look further, and as Catherine pointed out, the reason why youth are placed in solitary is for either offenses for which they should never be incarcerated, or for practices for which violations of rules that are minor in nature and should not result in the use of something as drastic as solitary confinement. And it's what makes me believe that for, in so many places, when you have correctional officers who are on hourly wages, who don't have any skills or training in terms of how they relate to a prison population, who have preconceived ideas of what those youth and what young adults are like at those ages, it's just a recipe for disaster. When I practiced in Texas, I was fortunate because I practiced in the county just north of Dallas, which was just under 1 million people, and it had excellent public schools throughout those suburbs, and it also had a large number of very well-educated adults who cared about children. And so as a result, the county board didn't have the kinds of financial limitations that other supervisors might find in other counties. And so we had no hourly employees at our juvenile detention center. Everyone had a college degree. Many of them had master's degrees. People were, and officers never place kids in isolation. If someone was a, quote, suicide risk, they were with that officer constantly. No one ever left their side. And so you just have this enormous chasm of differences, where I know that if you went north to the next county, to Grayson County, the picture was completely 180 degrees different. And so it says a lot about, again, what happens in these institutions, why kids are being picked up, why they're being detained, why they're not being diverted, how they end up with long sentences, and then what the programming is like at those institutions.
All very concerning issues. I'm wondering if any of the attendees or people who are listening have any questions. You could call or type in case you want to ask any questions of the doctor, of Linda, or of Catherine. I think it's clear from the journey that we've been taking that notwithstanding the intent of the Quakers at the turn of the century, the 19th century, to use solitary as an opportunity for sober reflection and penitence, that those ostensibly laudatory aspirations unfortunately have had very much the opposite effect. Any other panelists have any comments or observations to share regarding what we've been chatting about?
I think this conversation is an interesting one when you compare as well to what's happening at the border with migrant children and the circumstances in which they're being placed as well, because, you know, they're not much different than the worst circumstances of juveniles. And so it appears that, you know, we just need to do so much more to help vulnerable children and youth.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
Yes, absolutely, that's the case.
And I think that the issue with that, a lot of people, especially when it's in a juvenile charge as an adult or in an adult prison, because I believe the public, which is why my organization does so much motivational speaking and public education, is that they think when a juvenile is charged as an adult, that their charges must be extremely heinous. And so for some reason, people look at that as that it kind of strips you of your humanity. But the bottom line of it is that it's still a child. It's still a juvenile. And as our campaign says, no child is born bad. So they're still at an age where mentally and emotionally they're still growing, they're still developing, they have a capacity for change and reformation that adults doesn't have, you know, that's brain science stuff. But that if they don't look at them as convicts or inmates or felons, but look at them as children, I think that the lens in which this topic is looked at by the public and by the people that can make the policy changes, I think it would completely change when they look at the humanity of it and not exactly their mistakes or what they were incarcerated for.
Brian Stevenson has observed, there's even a T-shirt to that effect that I bought at the Legacy Museum, which states that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. Certainly true of all of us, truer, I suppose, for adolescents and emerging adults. But as regards to conversation, I think it's important to connect this to some of the research we do have, because I think we all agree about the traumatic effects of the practice of solitary confinement. But I think we would also do well to draw attention to policymakers and legislators about the recidivism. There is research, and this connects directly to your point, Catherine, about what happens to people who are put into the adult system. The states that put large number of youth into their adult systems, either by prosecutorial discretion, direct transfer, that means category exclusion legislatively, have the highest recidivism rates. And I don't think that's surprising. You have systems which are more rehabilitative and sensitive to actually honoring the Supreme Court notion of youth as being categorically different than children. Those jurisdictions have dramatically lower recidivism rates. So, you know, we talk about humanity, which it's an understatement to say that's important. There's also a direct connection in terms of to what's best for public safety, and we all know that you save a lot of money by not incarcerating people unnecessarily.
Absolutely.
I think it's important to make these connections. So any final words, observations? Linda, perhaps you should, I'll defer to you.
I feel like, you know, that each year we watch different jurisdictions tackle this issue and really walk through the same process of going to their legislators, passing laws, looking at the worst counties in the state, bringing lawsuits, And it just takes us a long time to abandon this practice. And it's interesting to me that the history of solitary confinement really had been laid to bed, and then all of a sudden it was resurrected. And
Right.
so I think that whatever we can do as lawyers to push against this, the better off the juvenile justice system will be.
Well, you make a really important point, because when the practice was resurrected in the late or mid to late 20th century, notably 1980s, not surprisingly, it was in an era when, if you're looking at you through a developmental lens, the narrative was then had shifted, and people were talking about adolescence somehow being different. This was in the heyday of the super predator mythology. I think now we've hopefully we all acknowledge we're learning a lot more. I've learned a lot more about adolescence, and I think that it's time to revisit the practice. And as you noted, Linda, a number of states have. You included it. You included that in your presentation about states that are taking a more enlightened position on this issue. Certainly, it's embarrassing when you go to Europe and you look at how people are detained and incarcerated in most European countries, even for the more serious offenses. Their systems are dramatically less retributive, and the recidivism rates are lower. So that's a point that I think it's important to keep making and making. It turns out that the psychology of supporting youth being in community, promoting the socially connective tissue of community, schools, and neighborhood, so that people like Kalief Browder could graduate high school and not be in Rikers Island, is not only good for the Kalief Browders of the world, it's much, much better for public safety. I think the research is there.
And I can add that support for the perspective that the judge is describing comes from both sides of the aisle in the criminal justice system. And also, it, in addition to that, is espoused by many folks within the corrections system as well, for juveniles and adults. This is, I would hope no one would think that this is the exclusive province of the defense bar.
And I think that's an incredibly important point to make. The fact that what's good for public safety is good for adolescents, I think we should be really happy about. It should be the proverbial win-win. Really pushing back on this policy, making the resolution something more that's aspirational, hoping that all states will follow suit. In addition to the ones that you've mentioned, Linda, should be part of our collective mission.
Yes, and as a final point, I'll also mention that there's another use of ABA policy that's really important. That is in lawsuits that are brought to higher courts on appeal. The ABA participates and writes amicus briefs under its name most often on grants of cert to the U.S. Supreme Court. But there also have been times when the ABA has written amicus brief to a state Supreme Court as well. And so it's something to keep in mind. We can do that when we have policy, and this is another issue in which we could write a brief if we were approached to do so.
And I think this policy on solitary confinement also corrects directly to the certainly as exemplified by the Browder tragedy, relates to the policy about revising bail. Because remember, Kalief was held the first 73 days that he was at Rikers, or 74 days, when he couldn't make a $3,000 cash bail. The bail was set not with consideration to court appearance. It was set in a more robotic manner. So the ABA has adopted resolutions revisiting the use of cash bail.
I think we are at the closing hour, I want to take this opportunity to thank our moderator and our panelists for their presentation today, and for the audience. We thank you for attending today's webinar. We hope that you will consider joining the Criminal Justice section if you are not already a member. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fun to participate.